Julia Washington Berry is one of 16 Hamiltonians being celebrated as part of Black History Month. She worked as the toll keeper at the top of James Street long before most of us were born. Justin Chandler covers Hamilton Niagara for Ontario Hubs, and he joins us now on the significance of her story. Welcome, Justin, not in the Hammer this time, here in studio.
Thank you, it's amazing.
Well, let's talk about someone who has a pretty interesting story and is being celebrated in Hamilton, Julia Washington Berry. Who is she?
So Julia Washington Berry was born around 1850, maybe in Hamilton. We're not entirely sure about that, but she ended up living in Hamilton for most of her life. And she lived in this unique Black community up on the mountain, which is what we call the escarpment. And she was the toll keeper for part of her life. She had a big family, and she worked in a toll booth. And she's being honored this month.
And we saw a photo actually of her, of Berry there. Tell us, do we know what time that photo was taken as well?
No, not exactly sure when that was taken. It's undated. That's from her family. Her family's history book, which I was able to flip through.
All right. So there's something quite unusual in terms of the documentation of Julia Washington Berry. Her job. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so the fact that Julia Washington Berry being a toll keeper was noted in census records was unusual for the time. Most women's waged labor was not noted unless they were widowed, but she was married and her husband was alive. But this is actually connected to her name, and so that's part of the official record. I spoke to a historian about this, Adrienne Shad. She wrote a book about Hamilton's Black history called The Journey from Tollgate to Parkway, Tollgate referencing Julia Berry. And we don't really know why her name was included with her occupation, but it was kind of an interesting thing that allows us to know more about what her life was like.
All right, we're going to get back to Adrienne, but I do want to talk about Judy Morgan. We have a photo of Judy Morgan. This is a descendant of Julia Washington Berry. Tell us a little bit about them and sort of how they're trying to reconnect with Julia.
Yeah, well, Julia had 10 kids. So big family, and going through the family history book, I can tell you there's a lot of descendants. And Judy was who I was able to meet with to go through that and to learn a little bit more and get some of those photos that we saw. She's her great-granddaughter. And interestingly, Judy's father is also being honored this month. He was a reverend in Hamilton, Robert Foster. And so she's just feeling really good about having two members of her family be honored. She said she was never much into history growing up. But she said she feels quite proud now that people are recognizing their accomplishments.
Tell us what we're looking at here.
Right, so this is an old family photo of Julie Washington Berry. So you can see her husband there is in the center. She's off to the side on the right there, and there's a lot of members. You can see they all looked quite dapper, a really dashing family.
Very big family as well. All right. So as you were talking about, you spoke to historian Adrienne Shad, who has written a book about the history of Black settlement in Hamilton. What did you learn about the early days of that settlement?
I think the word that Adrienne used to describe it was Hamilton was a going concern for the Black community. So people were owning businesses, they were buying property. There were people who were former slaves that had moved into Hamilton, but also people coming in from free states. And she said that according to records, it seems like people were doing quite well. There was still racism and issues like that, of course, but compared to later, even in the 20th century, Black communities were maybe a lot more economically prosperous at this period in the 1800s.
All right, tell me a little bit geographically. Obviously, when we talk about the city of Hamilton, many people may or may not know we got the downtown and we have the mountain. When we're talking about these early Black settlements, where geographically were they in the Hamilton area?
So one of the major ones that Adrienne focused on in her book and where Julia Washington Berry was up on the mountain, on the escarpment, along where Concession Road is now.
All right. Now, there's something interesting in terms of what Adrienne Shad was talking about in her book, and then sort of what the early narrative was when we talk about the city, what they had called Little Africa. Tell us a little bit about that. How did that differ?
Yeah, so as far as Adrienne could tell, based on her research, this name Little Africa, which actually still gets used today, was maybe the creation, or at least first used, by Mabel Burkholder, who was a Hamilton Spectator columnist in the 1930s. And Adrienne says that really there was a lot of maybe misnomer, maybe some stereotyping happening there, where she wrote about this sort of community where all these former slaves had come, were given land, and lived there. She spoke about them being maybe sort of subservient Adrian said that was not the case. A lot of people bought land. There were some former slaves, but there were also people from free states. And these were people who were building a lot of community. And so she said even that name was not something that, as far as she could tell, was ever used at the time.
And why is it important that that history be shared? That it's not necessarily, Black people who came to Hamilton seeking refuge, returning to the U.S., but they actually stayed here and sort of built the city.
Yeah, well, number one, it's more true. So we need to know what actually happened. But also, when we think about Hamilton's history, a lot of that gets tied to labor, white communities, and the Black community can often be erased. And this happens all throughout Ontario, of course. So really, it's important to remember that the Black community was there. There were people like Julia Washington Berry who were not rich or famous, but were community builders, were active in church, in groups like the Masons, and who really made a place their home. And that's part of Hamilton's history too.
When we talk about toll keepers in general, I found this interesting in your article. Tell me exactly what the role of a toll keeper is. What was Julia's job?
Right, so she would sit in a booth, and a lot of roads at the time were privately owned. And so when vehicles would come through, they would have to pay a toll to get by. So kind of interesting now when you think about how the city is laid out.
Generally speaking, when we talk about the city of Hamilton, of course, we talk about 16 Black people who are being celebrated for their contributions to the city. Tell us a little bit about that initiative and sort of where the city wants to take that.
Yeah, that's something that the city did for Black History Month. And so they picked people who've all passed now. But there were people like Julia Washington Berry who lived long ago. There were people who maybe died more recently. But it's a really interesting initiative in the sense that it brought all these people together. And the city worked to get their stories out there. So they had plaques at different libraries, for example, or community centers where you could read about people. They also had banners with people's faces on light posts along James Street in Hamilton.
Justin Chandler, very great stuff. We just learned a lot about Julia Washington Berry. Thank you so much for joining us on the program and in studio.
Oh, no problem.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.